Good afternoon, everybody. This is Bob Cruz with Checkpoint Technologies. Thank you very much for joining us for today's presentation on shift left testing. What the heck does that mean? So your presenters today are Jim Parson and myself. And Jim, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself to the audience.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Hi, my name is Jim Parson. I'm a senior technical engineer here at Checkpoint Technologies. I've been in the IT field for about the past 15 or 16 years. Last 5 or 6 have been really concentrating on QA and testing and test automation. Previous to that, as a business analyst, technical analyst, in multiple different roles. I'll be your presenter today on shift left testing. What the heck does it mean?
Great, thank you, Jimmy. And again, my name is Bob Cruz. I am president and founder of Checkpoint Technologies. I've got about 28 years in IT, started off as an IBM DB2 COBOL programmer, and then in the mid-90s developed quite the passion for quality assurance and software testing. And we are very excited to bring you this webinar today on shift left testing. I think it's a word or a phrase we've all heard, and Jimmy and I are hoping to demystify shift left testing for you today. A little bit about Checkpoint Technologies. We incorporated in January of 2003, so we just celebrated our 13-year anniversary, and our primary focus is quality assurance and quality control, specifically in functional, performance, and application security testing from both a planning, manual testing, and automated testing perspective. We are an Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Software Gold Partner. We actually started off as a Mercury Interactive partner back in 2003. We're also a training partner and software support partner for HP. And we are also very proud to be partnered with Zephyr, Mobile Labs, and Turnkey, who all make leading-edge solutions to address software testing challenges. And then we are also affiliated with QAI Worldwide. So QAI, that stands for Quality Assurance Institute. And if you ever need training on software testing 101, efficient test case design, things along that line, that's something we can certainly provide to you, because we're more than just tool experts. We are truly experts in quality assurance and software testing. The services we've provided to numerous organizations throughout the United States include staff augmentation. So if you needed some strong testing resources to be part of your team for a long-term contract, we can certainly do that, whether it's on-site or remote. We also provide consulting. So a lot of organizations will give us a call to handle any upgrades they might have, or installation, configuration, and customization for different solutions. We also provide outsourcing services. So our version, if you will, of offshore. We have a 7,800 square foot facility in sunny Tampa, Florida, where we can house a team. And then we also provide education, so structured classroom training or tailored mentoring. So where we will go on site in your environment and educate your team on how to use a solution, and real work gets done. So that's been a very successful offering for us. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call. Now, just a little bit about the control panel. So we're using GoToWebinar. All of you should see this control panel on your screen. I want to emphasize the questions area. Please feel free to participate and ask any questions, and also feel free to share comments that you might have. Jimmy and I would love nothing more than for this to be a very interactive presentation. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jim and shift left testing. What the heck does that mean? Go ahead, Jim.
Thanks, Bob. So yeah, this is Jim Parson, and I'm going to get into the demonstration and the presentation part of the webinar, and just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea, how this is going to kind of progress. We want to talk a little bit about kind of the history and how test automation and testing has evolved, and why shift left testing has really started to become more and more of a focus over the last couple of years and become a real big industry buzzword, along with some other terms that kind of get confused with shift left testing, and that is DevOps and continuous integration. So to get started, we want to look at, traditionally, how did automation and testing start, and where was it at in the SDLC, so that we can see why it's evolved and what's pushing that to the left. So when you look at the slide that we're looking at right now, you're seeing the basic SDLC is laid out from planning stages, information analysis, through unit testing, integration and testing, and implementation, and it's a big circle depending for each release. In a traditional waterfall methodology, your testing, really the heavy testing happens in the integration and testing area of this slide, or this visual, and that's right prior to implementation. And really what that shows is that, with the exception of unit testing, which is done by your developers, the heaviest amount, the greatest volume of testing is done, right prior to you, implementing that release. What that does is it pushes your people, traditionally, to have more business knowledge as far as for testing, less technical knowledge, because really your testing is not being done by, in that development area or integrated with development. Another thing it does is pushes your defects to be found later in the SDLC, and and that really gives you a lot higher cost to fix them, and they have a greater impact on delivery. And and we'll talk about this throughout the rest of the presentation as we start talking about more of the shift left principles. But looking at a traditional test automation or testing methodology in a waterfall SDLC, that defect being found right prior to implementation certainly can have a huge impact on whether you can release on time, whether it's going to really affect core functionality, security, things like that. Being found that late in the SDLC certainly and really can have a huge impact on your development, testing, and the release of the application itself.
And one of the things I would highlight here is, as Jimmy's pointed out, but take a look at how the diagram really focuses on two things, and that is a timeline, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment, as well as technical expertise as opposed to business expertise. And we're going to discuss that in the context of shift left testing as well.
Sure. And so, so when we talk about traditional test automation, and that's really where shift left, starts to become very important. You can apply some of these methodologies even in manual testing and efforts and that, but really when you start shifting left, it starts to affect that automation, test automation, because that's really where technical skills become more important. But in a traditional test automation setup, in long release cycles, well-defined testing windows, feature-packed releases of the entire application, and those traditional tools like QTP and Selenium and those automated testing tools, and there's multiples of them. TestBear has different software. There's lots of companies that have them, but the features that they had were enhanced or developed for a business knowledge or business savvy application engineer or test engineer, and that is they had record and playback, very simple scripting. You didn't have to know a lot of technical stuff to be able to create robust automated test scripts. So what does that mean and what changed? Well, Agile changed. Once Agile entered kind of the market and became more and more mainstream, more companies are starting to adopt it as their methodology for application development, and Agile has really changed that whole dynamic and understanding of how applications are developed. It's gotten away from that traditional waterfall method, and that your release cycles are a lot shorter. You have it's a lot less formal of a setup or how you actually create your SDLC, and that you don't need to have formal requirements a lot of times. You have a lot less documentation. But in addition to that, your defects are found sooner. It's more of an iterative process, smaller chunks of code released faster that can stand alone versus that big feature-packed one release that you have in Waterfall. So when you look at what the biggest impacts that Agile's had, you start to look at that short release cycles, and testing is integral to development. And that becomes very important when you talk about shift left and some of these some of the techniques of shifting left, and because of the fact that now you don't have that long release time to develop tests, you need to be able to be working actually with that developer, which is a natural progression for your test automation engineer, and that they have to become more technical. They have to be able to speak the language of a developer and be comfortable in it. They have to understand the technology, that's in place, and what that developer is, doing whether it's, making database connections or whether it's, optimizing the network and different calls. You have to, that tester now has to understand that more so than just understanding that, I want to create an order in an ERP system or something along those lines.
Those are great points, Jimmy. I mean, 27, 28 years ago, back when I started my IT career, I was with Addison Wesley, a publishing company, and we would have a release perhaps every 9 to 12 months. So as you can imagine, during that 9 or 12 months, the fixes, the enhancements, or the changes would be piling up. So once it was turned over to the QA team or whomever was responsible for testing it, they would have hundreds and hundreds of revised features and functionality that they had to validate. So it was without a doubt overwhelming.
Right. And I think, one of the evolution of just applications, mobile applications, and how that they're a lot quicker to market. There's a window there that, you're trying to take advantage of, lends itself more towards shift left type testing and agile development in general. Some of the old legacy and big enterprise level applications, they tended to be waterfall because they were stable. They had set requirements. They were able to do that. Now, I mean, I think the whole geographic of application development has started to change, just the marketplace itself. So to be able to take advantage of that. So Agile has really become a very big part of most new development in a lot of companies. There's others, other methodologies, but really, Waterfall and Agile are probably the two, most well-known. And there's obviously different flavors of Agile, and that we could go into, but we're looking at it more as an overall perspective, not into the one-offs of like extreme programming or extreme Agile and stuff like that. So we have these two kind of common methods and of application development, Waterfall and Agile. So now we see what Agile has kind of pushed into the market, which started to affect those even people in Waterfall development platforms and methods. And now we see, well, what is shift left? And we enter shift left testing, and what does that mean?
Right. And we're going to take this opportunity, folks, to ask you to participate in a poll, and this will help Jimmy and I out significantly, and that we can better tailor the presentation as we go. So we'd like to know your level of expertise. So what is your understanding of shift left testing? Have you just recently heard the buzzword and you have a slight idea of what it is? Are you looking into implementing shift left testing at your organization? Or have you already started implementing shift left? Would you consider yourself a mature shift left organization? Or are you in the last bullet where you're asking yourself, what the heck is shift left testing? So if we can just take a moment, if you could answer that. Great, getting some great results here. This is very helpful. I'm going to give it just another minute or two. I'm going to spare you from me doing my Jeopardy theme song. All right, this is great. This is great. So Jimmy, here are the results. So in our audience, 26% have just heard the buzzword. 23% are looking into implementing shift left testing. I love seeing that. 27% have started implementing shift left testing. Only 1% would consider themselves a mature shift left organization, and 23% are asking themselves, what the heck is shift left testing? So Jimmy, what anything here surprise you or interest you?
Well, no, Bob. I think that that's kind of what I was anticipating. When we started thinking about an audience for this webinar and this presentation, that's what the title was. Is what the heck is it? I was expecting a lot of our audience to not have a lot of information about it and want to learn about it. So hopefully we're living up to the 1% that's out there that understands it and has implemented it and is very mature and shift left, and that we're giving them some value too.
Absolutely, fantastic. Well, that's no, and I agree. I mean, and for the 1% there where you consider yourself a mature organization, please type in the questions any thoughts that you have. We'll be more than happy to share that with everybody.
Yep, and that and that's good. I mean, it's nice to have somebody out there that has that expertise, and they can give us feedback and possibly comments on what experiences they've had in implementing some of these concepts. So.
Right.
So when we talk about shift left testing, we want to talk about some of the benefits of it, and this all ties back into kind of that what Agile's pushed, but it doesn't, I mean, we want to get away from this understanding or this feeling that just because you implement shift left concepts that you have to be an Agile shop or that you have to buy into one particular methodology of software development. So keep that in mind as we go forward. When we talk about detecting and preventing defects earlier in the SDLC as being one of the benefits, that could be just an incremental shift in the way that your company, and your processes are, and maybe where you start testing. So this isn't an all or none type of approach. So I just want to make sure that that's that people understand that before we start getting into this any deeper. When we talk about a shorter time to market, lowers risk and cost, and that's the other part. Like like I said, it can be a combination of methodologies and frameworks. So even if you're in a waterfall development, application development or software development methodology, you can, just by using, creating a robust automation framework that truly is automation with tools that you might already have. If you have UFT or QTP or Selenium, having tests that run without any manual interaction, things that can be scheduled that are standalone so that you might be able to take advantage of, maybe not currently, but either either your test management tool, for UFT, like ALM or Selenium actually integrates with ALM too, but just being able to run those tests on a schedule, that's shifting left. You're becoming more technical. And the same thing with methodologies is, you can apply more Agile principles, and there's a hybrid approaches to Agile and Waterfall, and kind of a combination of both. I think people have had varying levels of success of that, but I mean there's always kind of shades of gray as far as that. You don't have to, everything is not black and white as far as it is. So, and then we talk about it encompasses some elements of QA into a single approach. Static and dynamic testing, automation, which I just mentioned, dashboards, going to that continuous integration type of model are all benefits of being able to of shifting left. I know, Bob, I think you had an example of some of that.
Yeah, I mean, just to share a few points on this, when everybody realizes, I'm sure everybody on the call realizes that detecting issues and defects earlier in the life cycle is a huge benefit. But that in and of itself has benefits as well, because the earlier you find defects, you give your development team more time to resolve those issues. And it lets them look for patterns so that they don't duplicate that same defect over and over again. In addition, it lets you identify the scarier issues or the scarier defects which are of greater risk to your organization so that you can get those out of the way. And then in this last bullet, when we talk about static and dynamic testing, so static testing, as I'm sure you all know, you've all heard the phrase verification and validation. So with static testing, that is verification, so peer reviews, walkthroughs, code inspections. I absolutely love those. 18 years ago, I was on an IT project with the FBI, and they were religious about their peer reviews and walkthroughs. And it was absolutely amazing the number of defects that we would find. So let alone that those defects didn't get into production, they didn't even get into the code because we found them during the requirements or design stage. So I'm a huge proponent of that kind of stuff, and it amazes me the number of organizations that still do not incorporate that element of shift left testing.
And and I think one thing that Bob didn't mention, but that is, he's talking almost 20 years ago. No, the shift left was not even an idea in anybody's mind at that point in time, as far as as a buzzword. These are good test methods and good processes and procedures have been around a long time. I think it's just currently that they've kind of been bundled underneath a good, short, concise kind of a branding of shift left and a trademark, or however you'd like to put it that way. So, just to kind of highlight some of those things, of when we start talking about benefits and what shift left does, we go back to looking at a traditional testing model, and what we see here is that, the system test is in the, after development and, before integration and end-to-end type of testing, and, and then right before, implementation, if we looked at the other SDLC. But it just, comes back to highlight that these bugs and defects being found in this late in the SDLC makes that, can affect delivery schedule. It can affect, the fact of even, being able to release and or have other issues in the release where you'd have to push back that delivery schedule. Bugs tend to hang around longer. They might, just even if they're, they're found and discovered even after possibly your system test in UAT and your app, your user testing. We know that it costs more to fix bugs the later in the SDLC they're found, and then there's always been the slide or the knowledge that, and like I said, I think it was if a bug is found in testing or development, it's 400 times less expensive than finding it in production. And that's just one of those ones I remember, and I could be off on the number. It just was exponentially cheaper to find it in your development or testing cycles than it was to find it in production. So looking at this, when we go to looking at shift left, what we're saying is we're not saying that you're changing the types of testing you're doing. What you're saying is taking those assets and those processes and start utilizing them earlier in the SDLC. So as part of Agile has been pushed as far as the integration of testing and development itself as part of being that process. That's what we're saying here is you can start to do those things even if you're not utilizing Agile. Start pushing it a little closer to development. Start involving those automation engineers and your QA people just earlier in the cycle to start figuring out when you can start that testing as early as possible.
So, and let me talk about this slide for just a moment, Jimmy, because as you just mentioned, you can involve QA earlier in the process. But another thing that you can do, which a lot of organizations are doing, and there's nothing wrong with this, is having your developers adopt more of a QA and software testing mindset so that they are more accountable and that the developers themselves are doing more testing. I mentioned the FBI project that I was on, but besides that, I've also been on a Veterans Affairs, Department of Veterans Affairs project, as well as numerous others where they had a very, very structured way of doing unit testing. So it was very robust, and then they would even have their developers do a certain degree of integration and system testing as well. So when you look at this visual, don't simply view Dev 1, Dev 2, Dev 3, and system test as groups or departments. View them as tasks that could possibly be done by the developers as well.
That's a good point, Bob. So when we talk about this, I mean, here's a comparison of those two, of shift left versus the SDLC. When we look at the most of the issues are captured early in the SDLC versus captured in later. And, on this graphic, just kind of in just a visualization of really what we've talked about in the first couple of slides. The big one to me is in the bottom part of the green arrow or green line is that the minimal to no cost to fix defects, and that with the way budgets are and the way the marketplace is and everything, the cheaper it is to fix a bug, obviously that leaves more budget, more resources available for possibly testing other pieces of code or things that don't get tested, or just having that ability to show value to your upper management as far as that you're effective in your testing methods. We all know QA is always a lot of times is looked at as it's not a revenue producing department. So being able to show value is is important also.
Yep, great point.
So what we want to explain too is also to tell you what shift left testing is not, and that's the biggest misconception I think when I talk to people is that everybody, a lot of people think that shift left is DevOps, or shift left is continuous integration, or that or it's strictly Agile, or all that, and it's not that. The shift left is not a type of testing. It's when the testing is being done. And all we're saying is you're going to shift left earlier in the life cycle, and on the bottom it's not a how but a when. And we talk about the actual SDLC, and we'll explain a little bit more about what that means, even to your resources, because that's a part of it. I mean, shift left is kind of an ideology of moving towards it earlier into the SDLC, but that necessary, makes it necessary for those resources to sometimes shift their knowledge and skills to actually take advantage of this. And that we'll discuss that a little bit later on in the presentation of what it takes. So when we talk about different testing approaches, we're kind of do this at a high level in the fact that we could probably do a full hour on test-driven development and behavior-driven development and these things and just to explain them, but test-driven development is a lot of times you'll see it references TDD, behavior-driven development, BDD. We all love our acronyms. Test-driven development is a process where you write and run your tests along with writing the codes, and you run the tests until the code passes. So it's tightly integrated with your testing and your code development. And the behavior-driven development is really a best practice for writing user stories, or writing tests as user stories. So it's just kind of making a suggestion to instead of thinking how that code is ultimately going to be implemented, you focus on the business scenario that you're trying to test. Service or orientated architecture testing is really starting to eliminate some of that functional testing of the GUI and actually get down to the service layer, and that so API testing, web service testing, those types of tests that really kind of look at the tip of the iceberg and functional testing is great. You're testing whether that screen works and whether you can submit, but underlying that, there's a lot of code and a lot of testing that can be done without interacting with the GUI. So there's a lot of tools out there, SOAP UI and UFT or service test, and that take advantage of being able to test those web services. And then unit testing, which has been around, and Bob has mentioned, that a lot of companies, and most development, it revolves around that, that's where your developers are doing your testing at the code level. But I mean, that's a piece of shifting left and part of that approach. I think more so Bob was mentioning that structured and what was the other for unit testing? Was structured and
the structured unit testing, and then also having a sign-off, so that before the QA team would accept it, there would actually be meetings where the QA team would have to sign off and approve the quality of the unit testing that was done by the developers.
Okay. So, and we're going to we have a little graphic here on kind of how to think of shift left testing and really what it's asking as far as now, we start talking a little bit more about our resources and we see how things are. So here's another thought on shift left testing. Traditionally, years ago, you had your developer and your end user. Your developer was writing the code and he was probably testing his own code. You didn't really have a QA department involved at that level. Your developer is truly technical and your end user is really business savvy, and he knows the processes and procedures of the business and the business scenarios. The developer would write the code, release the application, and then the end user would find a bug or find a problem, and so it just wasn't an efficient use of development, and things evolved. So now we added in a layer of QA. So that QA person now has got a lot of business knowledge, but he's a little bit left and a little bit closer to that developer as far as technical skills. He's able to do some interpretation of what the developer's doing and writing in code, and kind of translate those, back and forth between the business end user and the developer, so that you can, develop a robust application. And then, then we started adding in automation. And, the automation tools kind of came about and evolved. And our automation guy, now he's a little bit more casual, and but he's also a little bit further left on that spectrum. It's necessary for somebody in automation to have a little bit more technical skill than a traditional manual tester in QA, and you start to see that. And really, that's the shifting left. We're shifting things left to be more technical. So whether it's because of the shifting it closer to development in the SDLC, or whether it's because you're using Agile methodology, whether it's DevOps or continuous integration, these other pieces of testing and continuous testing, it's necessitated, a mindset and a skill set that has to evolve to be more technical. And it's not just your automation engineers. It's you're going to have everybody on that team is going to have to at least start to understand a lot more of what that developer is saying and how that developer works, so that you have the correct verbiage inside the team as you're shifting away.
Excuse me. And Jimmy, I want to share something that that one of our attendees, a point that Sue has made. She makes a great point, in that when you're having the development team, or the developer, if you will, take on more responsibility for QA and testing, then you need to be sure to adjust the timeline. So therefore, you would provide more time for the developer to do what they need to do, and then logically you would then remove some of the time that the QA group would need, because perhaps they're focused strictly on regression testing. And you said, okay, our developer is going to do unit testing, integration testing, and system testing. And you can mix it up, you can customize it and tailor it for what's right for your organization, but don't forget about adjusting time allocation because of that. So great point by Sue, thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make, and I mean, and depending on the organization, we talk about, Agile obviously, is talking about the tester and the actual developer almost sitting around the same table and being in the same room and being very collaborative. And in some organizations, that's, even if you're kind of taking that approach a little bit more, you're moving towards shift left, that might not be where you're at yet. And it might not be where you want to go. You might have a formal QA department, and that's kind of where you want to keep it, and you're going to have that separation. But at that point, when duties start to change, like Bob and Sue just mentioned, you have to look at timelines. You have to look at what those duties are, and who's completing them to make sure that you stay on track. So, in this graphic, we're looking, like I said, it's just illustrating that, as shift left has been, it starts being incorporated, you're going to, your team is going to become more technical, or need to become more technical, and be able to speak the language and understand what that developer is saying, at more, more so than they currently are. If you're, especially in a traditional test, automation or testing environment in waterfall methodology. So when we talk about different things, there are things that are starting that have, over the last few years, that have really started to enable some of this shifting left. And prior to that, 4, 5, 6 years ago, there was automated test tools out there. UFT has been around for a long time. Before that, I know Bob's had experience with Windrunner and other tools that were out there to help with some of this automation. And they were good for what they did, and they were designed at that time for more of your business, business skill set or mindset. And like I talked about at an earlier slide, they had record and playback, and you just had the ability, to create tests and automation without having a great deal of technical knowledge. Well, those same tools are around, and those and others have been developed over the last couple of years that have really started to allow, things that kind of were, in a pie in the sky dream in the past, and that was because we just didn't have the resources available to a lot of organizations to be able to take advantage of some of the actual, physical hardware and environments that are needed for this. And so, when we look at testing tools, UFT has been around a long time, but that's evolved, and they've added in the ability for some of the API testing as a part of UFT. Selenium was developed for web testing, and that had a record and playback feature. There's also the WebDriver and other kind of little modules of Selenium and frameworks that are out there that have been designed to take advantage of continuous integration and DevOps. When we talk about LeanFT, that's a new, very new product from HP that came out in the last year. That's a functional testing solution that's specifically been built for continuous integration and continuous testing. So they've kind of evolved UFT and saw that there was a need for this and put a tool out for that. When we talk about Selenium, has its WebDriver and a lot of integration with other test management tools and the automation and CI servers that are on here, like Hudson and Jenkins. But Selenium, when you combine it with Appium, Appium's a framework in Selenium for mobile testing, and all standalone, and leverages the Selenium kind of platform to give you mobile testing capability. Cucumber is a software for computer programming, built on Ruby, and it's for the behavior-driven BDD style that we talked about a few minutes ago. And Water is another family of Ruby libraries for doing automated web browsers. So it's the same kind of a thing like like a WebDriver and Selenium. Water is out there as another alternative, and a lot of these are open source or low cost, all the way up to enterprise level stuff like UFT and LeanFT, and that gives you kind of the marketplace of applications to do your testing. And the automation and continuous integration servers like Hudson and Jenkins have multiples, hundreds of plugins to different types of test applications, test management stuff that from deploying builds and running tests, UFT type tests, Selenium tests automatically. You know, and the other thing that's out there was not available years ago is really your cloud and VMware types of stuff. So you can spool up your test labs and resources and servers, builds, all of that stuff can be kind of scripted and automated. And so you can really take advantage of that continuous integration, continuous delivery, and the continuous testing kind of methodology that really shift left starts to start to enable and push you towards that. You know, and ultimately kind of the DevOps model, and you know, there's other things that do that. So so these applications that are out there have really evolved over the last few years to start to take advantage of that. They've become powerful enough to do a lot of this stuff without having to have somebody manually deploy builds and all of those things.
Yeah, all good points, Jimmy. All good points.
So, you know, we kind of defined a little bit of the history of SDLCs, and then we kind of talked about Waterfall method and Agile, and then kind of what shift left is, and, you know, and how to take advantage of it, and all of those kind of things as far as what's required. Now we talk about what's next. You know, I've got an idea what shift left is. You know, you guys have been talking for a half hour, 45 minutes, and now we want to know, what's the end game, what's the benefit. And, you know, so we want to talk about what's needed. And, you know, we talked about tools, we talked about, some resources as far as your team members. You know, we've talked about kind of core company values and things that have to be assigned, and, you know, people have to buy into a lot of that stuff. It's going to be an overall change to how a lot of companies or how a lot of people do business. So what's needed for shift left? You got to have the tools. You need to have environments set up. You know, I talked about VMware. You have to have that ability to deploy and undeploy and have those resources available. You need your resources have to be skilled and understand, you know, a lot of the technical stuff, and that's where, you know, providing that, which kind of flows into the next bullet of training. So if when you're looking at your resources, understanding what their strengths and weaknesses is, and you need alignment from the teams. You know, you definitely, when we start talking about, kind of pushing testing and development into that same, that same team, we're both all members of the same team. You know, there's different, QA and development in some organizations have been in a real adversarial type relationship, and now you're trying to take that out. Or QA has been very isolated. You know, they're very siloed. Developments did their thing. They throw everything over the wall to QA throws it back, and they might be in separate buildings, and all you see is a few emails back and forth. You're going to be asking them to do more and collaborate more.
And just a couple of points I'd like to make on this, Jimmy. So by tools, I don't want anybody to assume that we're talking about software licenses. So a tool can be something as basic as a standardized process. Something where you develop a process for a structured unit test, and a sign-off, or something where you implement standardized peer reviews and walkthroughs. So a process is also a tool. And then the other thing I'd emphasize is that the fourth bullet on training helps enable and promote alignment from the teams, because if you don't give your teams training on shift left and the benefits and the value, then in all likelihood they're going to be a lot less likely to embrace shift left testing.
Sure. No, I agree with that. I think that's one of the, that training is a very important part of this. So, what's an approach to implement shift left? And that is, like Bob said, acquire the appropriate tools for each strategy. And that doesn't necessarily mean, like he highlighted, it doesn't necessarily mean software and licenses. Start putting together the processes and procedures that are going to allow you to implement it, and give everybody those kind of tools in their toolbox to be able to utilize the benefits of shift left from whatever their title is or whatever their responsibilities are. Start identifying the critical areas or applications that you want to to implement shift left on. It might be a you know, you're doing a pilot project for, or if you're a large organization, you want to show the benefits so that you can roll it out company-wide. You might have to, you know, pick an application, pick a team. You know, maybe there's a team that's got a lot more technical skill that you could leverage so that it would be a little quicker to get up and running. And then, you know, we talked a little bit about it, but shift left principles, you know, have to become a part of the core culture, or a core part of your culture, because, you know, it just, as you're implementing those, you know, they need that buy-in from everybody. You can't do it, and people can't be on an island and kind of doing their own thing with this. You know, you're just never going to get everything to, you know, to work the way you want. And the last kind of 3 bullets are things that we want to, you know, we'll explain a little more detail after in further slides. So you want to consider a QA assessment. You know, you want to be able to implement quick wins. You want to be able to identify challenges. And so when we look at that, when we talk about considering a QA assessment, really what we're talking about is, you know, look at your, you know, your current assets as far as, you know, it's possible that if you're in the QA department and you start looking to shift left, you go down and talk to development or talk to your infrastructure team. You know, they might have VMware set up. They might be willing to, you know, might have some the ability to spool up some servers and virtual desktops for you. You know, they might have Hudson and Jenkins already in house. It might be as simple as maybe getting an add-in to your test management tool, or to, you know, UFT or Selenium or something like that, so that you could start to, you know, implement some of that, you know, the automated testing. You know, look at your methodology. You know, take an assessment. You know, if you're truly a waterfall team, have you already kind of started shift left without even knowing it? And, you know, and that's, you know, we talk about automation. There's a lot of times where you might have implemented an automation framework and with no intentions of looking at shift left. It was just the way it was. But it might be very easy to leverage that and you know, make it truly a standalone, or maybe it already is. And then look at your team and start to figure out, you know, what members make that team up, and who would be involved in the overall team, from the, you know, from development and QA and, you know, security and infrastructure and all of that you would need to have to be able to be successful with you know, implementing shift left. And then it comes down to, you know, the last 3, and they all kind of tie together: level of effort, you know, return on investment, and cost benefit. You know, when we talk about level of effort, you know, one of the things that we want to highlight, and what we've said is that, you know, shift left testing, it might not be for you. It might not be for your organization, and it's easily possible if you have a kind of a legacy application and it's very stable and you have very few functional or really big functionality releases. It's kind of just supporting what's there, and, you know, and it's kind of humming along by itself, and you know, everything's going well. There might not be a need for you to go out and shift left. You know, it could be everything's working the way you want it to work, and everything's fine. You know, I think that there's a lot more opportunity to shift left in most organizations than that. I think just with the marketplace being what it is, and the way apps are being developed for mobile and all of and everything else, and becoming more and more prevalent across all our devices, I think that software development and application development is, you know, is a larger, you know, and faster pace than what it was. So I don't think you see as many of those legacy and enterprise level applications that you could truly stay, you know, static with. But once you've kind of looked at that level of effort as to move shift left, it could be like we talked about. Maybe it's moving a little bit closer to automation. Maybe it's maybe it's doing a few things like that, implementing a framework, kind of standardizing some things, like Bob said with the unit testing, structured and standardized. You know, and then look at what the ROI is going to be, and then the cost benefit, and, you know, is the level of effort, you know, worth the return that you're going to get for that? Is it something that's really, you know, important to your organization? And then kind of do that cost benefit analysis after that.
And quality assurance and quality control assessments are something that we continue to do for numerous organizations, such as Harvard University, Home Shopping Network, and JP Morgan Chase. I can name several others. So just to share with the audience, this is something that we have a lot of expertise in. There are definitely benefits to having a neutral organization do the assessment. it takes the emotion out of it. But just to share that with all of you.
So that's the QA assessment type deal of suggestion. And when we talk about quick start activities, doing a requirements risk analysis, that's something very simple and straightforward that you could that could be implemented, and that's a shift left kind of type of method or that you could implement very easily or very quickly. Static testing, we've talked about the peer reviews, walkthroughs, code inspections, and structured and standardized unit testing. All these are things that do not require you to switch completely from a waterfall method, if that's where you're at, to Agile or some different methodology of development. These can be incorporated at any point in time in any kind of development methodology. But that's pushing you left, and then that we talk about finally kind of the challenges to adopting a shift left, and that you have to understand it's a culture shift, and that everyone is not going to buy into it, and we all have been in multiple organizations where things things change, large new ideas come in. Sometimes our management goes to a conference and they get the new buzzword, and all of a sudden they come back and in 2 days we're going to change everything, and it's hard to get that buy-in, and so it's got to be a culture shift. There's an initial software investment, and this can be anything from really nothing as far as from some of the open source tools to upgrading licenses or adding more licenses to enterprise level tools like UFT and Lean FT, and being able to have enough of these resources to build test labs and do all of the testing that you want. And then when building a team, as part of that assessment, when you're looking at your team, you're gonna understand what their strengths and weaknesses of their skills and what the team structure is and how that needs to be addressed. Well, then you're going to have to put that into practice, and that can be a challenge depending upon the organization and how the organization is structured. There could be a lot of resistance to incorporating testing and QA and a whole new methodology that way. And maybe your team doesn't have the technical skills and really is resistant to learning them, and that's not really something they're comfortable with. It also does require a team mentality, and when we talk about that, it's going to change the way that people interact with each other. You're going to have more, if and when they start to collaborate, you're going to see that your test and QA, people are going to should develop a rapport and together, kind of everybody pulling the oar in the same direction, and that could be a big change in some organization. And the last two are kind of tied together in the fact that you have to have a commitment from leadership, whether it's at the QA management level or manager level, all the way up to department heads and things like that. But all the way up to, at some point, you have to have a top level sponsorship, because this is going to require somebody to be able to sign off on purchases and budget, and also to be able to affect change, because you can have all the good intentions and have everything laid out, but if you don't have the person high enough in management to be able to push for that and actually get it done, your shift left and moving towards shifting left is going to be a challenge, or is not going to be successful. So, and I think that's.
Yeah, no, so we're going to actually go ahead and slide into the poll right now, because we've got some great questions that have been answered that we want to get into. But just a quick poll. So hopefully we've demystified shift left testing. So what are your thoughts on it? Do you love it? And are you ready to champion the cause at your organization? Can you see some of the value, but you need to research shift left testing more? Have you determined that it's not for your organization? Perhaps your organization is, like Jimmy mentioned earlier, just very, very mature, or I should say the application is mature and just not very dynamic. Or are you in a situation you still don't know what the heck shift left testing is? So if you could take just a moment on that. And on the first poll, by the way, we actually, somebody had asked, and I should have mentioned this, we had 145 people take that first poll. All right, great. So we're getting some great results in it. All right, fantastic. So far, we have got 35% saying that they love it and they're ready to champion the cause, and 61% can see some value but need to research more. And that is absolutely understandable. You want to do your due diligence. So now I tell you what, we're going to open it up to some questions, and we have gotten a few. So one of the questions I want to throw out, Jimmy, and we can decide whether you or I or both of us are going to answer this question. So one of the questions from Stacy, I'd love to know what metrics you found to be most effective during the transformation of shifting left, as well as dashboard measures once shift left has been implemented. So Jimmy, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and take that, and then you
Sure.
can interject afterwards. But you know, because with shift left, you really do want to emphasize prevention over simply detection. So instead of focusing on the total number of defects found, perhaps, one of the metrics you're going to look at is going to focus more on defect removal efficiency. Another thing you want to keep in mind, and this is true for your metrics as well as your dashboards, is you want to start to gauge the progress of defect detection across the different stages of software development lifecycle. So, you know, I'm going to take a look at what issues, and if you want to call them defects, you can, but what issues you might uncover during the strategic session. So when you are first meeting, you know, with end users and stakeholders to identify what risk there will be in developing or not developing an application. You would do the same for the requirements phase, for the design phase, for the coding phase, and so on right through to the test and integration phases or implementation phases. So those are some metrics and dashboards that you want to make sure that you look at to drive identifying where these issues and defects originate so that you can change your processes and prevent future defects.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think, you know, depending upon what type of reporting tools you're using, you know, I'm referring back to something like, you know, ALM, where you start to develop some KPIs and you can start to track some of that stuff over time. And that, you know, that'll help you with some of that identification in each of those different phases because you're going to have a timeline. So, you know, and ALM is project planning and tracking, but any tool where you're actually defining what, you know, what their you know, what your phases are, your sprints and scrums if you're using, you know, or your sprints when you're using, you know, Agile, you know, your releases and cycles and stuff like that, so you can see what's in them and then start to look at what, you know, what's found in those different cycles and milestones as far as on a timeline. I think that's the important part because you're, you know, it'll tell you when these things are being resolved, and you know, and you should start to see a trend of, you know, especially if as you shift left, you should start to see that trend of these, you know, the issues being resolved earlier and earlier and being caught earlier and earlier in each of those cycles.
Great. So, and here's another question from Robert. White box testing. Having QA write unit tests for the developer, is this something you have experience with? The QA person actually touches the code. So Jimmy, what are your thoughts on that? And then I'll share mine.
Well, I think, you know, one of the things that I've saw in rather than the QA person actually touching the code would be, you know, when you get that collaboration between the tester and the actual developer, is that QA person might be able to leverage that code the developer has actually developed for their test, their unit test, and then actually utilize that, you know, as the base or as kind of boilerplate to expand on for their.
So you've seen where the developer writes their own unit test and then they pass it over.
Yeah,
to QA.
or, you know, in the QA, because you know, when we start that iterative or the integrated process.
Right.
The tester and the tester and the developer are at the same table. You know, he knows what the code and what the developer is working on. It could be that, you know, hey, that's perfect for a test that I need to write. So rather than me trying to write all of that code, I can leverage that versus, you know, being actually writing that. You know, I think the challenge that you have also is, you know, we're talking about shifting left. You know, is having those QA resources that have the required technical skills to be able to do that. I don't think that there's probably a lot of organizations that are looking to shift left that might have, you know, somebody that's fluent in Java or VB or .NET or whatever that can actually get into the code itself.
Right, and then Robert, you know, my take on that, I've probably consulted for a little over 260 organizations, and I would say only about 2% of those actually have a QA department with the same level of programming expertise needed to actually write the unit test. So the unit test that they might write would be things, you know, pertaining to the UI, the user interface. Unit tests which are easily transitioned over to black box testing perhaps. But then as far as, you know, doing any type of pairwise testing, boundary testing, conditional and branches, things like that, it's very seldom that the QA team is writing test cases at that level for the developer. So I hope that answered your question. Let me see, what sort of automation frameworks have been found to be more effective for incorporating features in shift left, such as CI or continuous integration? Traditional automation frameworks are designed to create encapsulation layers which sometimes become difficult to integrate with tools such as Jenkins, and that's from Feroz. So great question. Jimmy, would you, I would say that's why you've seen a lot of these different solutions come out, such as Lean FT, you know, and Selenium, and they're designed more with shift left. And again, for those of you that are still a little fuzzy on what shift left testing is, it's really nothing more than testing, whether it's verification or validation, earlier in the life cycle. So that's truly what it is, and there are a lot of different approaches and methods that you can do with that.
So, and so, you know, as far as on that, and, you know, when we start talking frameworks, you know, a lot of it just depends on whether you're starting new or whether you're starting with a traditional automation framework that was developed already. You know, we have a lot of customers that we deal with that, you know, have already spent a significant amount of time developing a framework without that thought of continuous integration in mind. And that's where part of this QA assessment and understanding what that is, so that you can see the level of effort to either modifying that or whether you have, you know, whether you need to pick a different tool that's available that, you know, to do specific things. Because, you know, it might be that you have a very robust UFT framework in place. You might want to do some API type testing. You might want to do, you know, some other things that are more standalone, more shift left. And maybe Selenium is the tool that you take to start to develop the continuous integration piece at that point in time.
So great point. So just one more question that I'm going to field real quick, and then we're going to wrap things up. We're going a couple of minutes over. But one of the viewers mentions that they haven't seen or heard much difference between Agile with this than shift left testing. So is that the correct understanding? So to clarify that, Agile is definitely a shift left testing approach. But if you are shift left testing, that does not automatically imply you are Agile, because you might be DevOps, you might utilize continuous integration, or perhaps you utilize none of the above and you just have incorporated certain elements, because it's not an all or nothing philosophy. So everybody, I would like to say today we're going to wrap things up. Please feel free to continue to submit questions. Jimmy and I will answer all of those and get those out to you within the next 2 weeks. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yep, thank you very much. I appreciate all you guys' time, and, you know, yeah, keep those questions coming.
And the only other real quick thing I want to let you know about is we do have a couple of more webinars coming up, one on March 16th from noon to 1 on implementing a test automation framework, and another test more, test faster, test continuously. That's on Wednesday, April 13th from noon to 1. So mark those in your calendars. And for those of you in the Nashville area, we have a great event coming up. And we have 2 presentations, live presentations there, quieting the cacophony of mobile testing. I love saying that word, cacophony. And demystifying DevOps. And that's at the Lane Motor Museum, which is an incredible European car museum. So email us for the registration link if you're in the Nashville area. There's our email addresses. And again, this is Jim Parson and Bob Cruz. Thank you so much for joining us today. Bye now.
Yep, thank you.